undergoes a religious crisis. During a powerful religious retreat at his school, he becomes overwhelmed with fear of damnation and turns towards extreme pity. The confessions of his sins, he goes through penance, he performs penance, and he even considers becoming a Jesuit priest. For a time, he lives a life of strict religious devotion, hoping to cleanse himself of guilt and find salvation. However, this religious devotion eventually feels hollow and limiting. He begins to see the dogma of the church as another form of control, similar to the social and political expectations of Ireland. He recognizes that both religion and nationalism are forces that suppress individual creative expression and freedom. At this point, Stephen undergoes another transformation. His time towards a life dedicated to art and aesthetic creation. He realizes that his true calling is not to serve the church or the nation, but to forge his own identity as an artist. Stephen becomes increasingly reflective and philosophical. He is influenced by writers, he's influenced by thinkers and artists, and he develops his own theories of art and beauty. He distances himself from friends and family, choosing instead to pursue a path of intellectual and artistic independence. His relationships with others become strained, particularly as he rejects the expectations placed upon him by his mother, his teachers, and Irish society as a whole. The novel ends with Stephen's decision to leave Ireland in order to fully embrace his artistic destiny. He feels that only by going into exile can he escape the oppressive forces of home, family, or church, or nation to that matter, and truly realize himself. And if you read that novel, the final pages of the book are presented in the form of Stephen's diary entries. He expresses his belief in the need to create anew, to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. These were the lines. He sees himself as a kind of a modern day mythical craftsman and escape artist, and he's ready to take flight on wings of his own making. So, if we in essence, if we connect to the story, a portrait of the artist as a young man, it is a story of a young man's struggle to define himself in opposition to the societal structures, the societal expectations, or in opposition to the institutions that try to shape him. So, through Stephen Dedalus, Joyce, the writer, examines the journey of the modern artist, an individual who rejects conformity and chooses instead a life of self exile, creative freedom, and intellectual independence. The novels um, uh, it includes something like kind of a journey where it evolves from a very simple childhood perspective to the complexity of philosophical reflection, where it matches Stephen's growth into a self aware and determined artist. So, James Joyce is here recognized as a quintessential modernist writer whose outlook is deeply shaped by the Europeanized sensibility, despite his firm roots in Ireland. Though he was Irish, Joyce wrote in English and was deeply conscious of the cultural tradition which he operated through. And this tradition and his response to it profoundly influenced the development of his individual talent, a term you all must have studied T.S. Eliot's tradition versus individual talent. This is the same term which is borrowed from Eliot's critical vocabulary. Importantly, the tradition that shaped Joyce was not solely English, it was much European as it was Anglophonic. His modernist identity is deeply entwined with his hybrid inheritance, placing him at the intersection of multiple cultural influences. Now, Joyce's concern with language stands as one of the defining features of his work. He's not only fascinated by the expressive power of language, but also acutely aware where can be the limitations. He experiments with syntax, he experiments with vocabulary, and the narrative voice sometimes demonstrates an ongoing attempt to get rid of the boundaries of what language can convey, particularly in the depiction of consciousness and inner experiences. There is a linguistic experimentation, which is particularly evident in the other works, for example, Ulysses, and but it is already present in a germinal form in a portrait of the artist as a young man. The modernist sensibility that drives Joyce's writing also reflects his identity as an urban writer, his acute awareness of urban life, especially the psychological and social texture of Dublin, becomes an essential aspect of his style and thematic concerns. This attention to the city as a site of modern life aligns him with other key modernists and further cements his life in the movement. Furthermore, understanding Joyce's modernism is enriched by familiarity with the work of contemporaries like T.S. Eliot, as just mentioned, whose poetry, especially in the pieces like The Wasteland, explores similar themes of fragmentation or tradition or cultural decay. Eliot theoretical insights into tradition and the role of the artist provide a valuable lens through which to understand Joyn's own literary project. Presents some kind of a comparison, and this comparison highlights how both writers, while rooted in the English language, bring their work to a broader European cultural perspective. Um, Joy's personal life and experiences, they also had significant impact on shaping of the novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and his attitude toward Ireland, especially in the context of his nationalist politics and its religious institutions, also deeply influenced the novel's emotional and ideological core. One crucial historical and political influence was the fall of Charles Stewart Parnell, an Irish nationalist leader whose downfall, precipitated by both political betrayal and Catholic condemnation, left a lasting mark on Irish national consciousness. And Joyce, who grew up in that period, saturated by the memory of Parnell, was affected by his legacy and responded to it with a mixture of resentment and ambivalence. So, the treatment of Parnell by Irish society, especially the Catholic Church, and its role contributed to Joyce's uh, perspective towards both nationalism and institutional religion. this this becomes very complicated, very complex reaction, and this is also again embedded very much into the character of the protagonist Stephen Dedalus, and his intellectual awakening or the quest for artistic independence. They also reflect many times James Joyce's own struggles. So Stephen's um, nature is more or less like a rebel, and he's a rebellion against the narrow confines of Irish society, and his eventual self-exile, that also talks a lot about Joyce's personal journey away from Ireland in pursuit of creative freedom. Joyce's skepticism of both nationalist fervor and the rigid doctrines of Irish Catholic hierarchy manifests in Stephen's character development or ideological development, and his resistance to all forms of ideological conformities. It is also here important to understand that the early 20th century was a period when developments in poetry and fiction were occurring in close and mutually influential proximity. Writers and authors were often responding to the same cultural crisis, same modernity, fragmentation, the collapse of tradition, and the search for new forms of meaning, etc. The overlap between different literary forms, poetry and prose per se, was especially significant during this period. And when discussing the development of modernism and the influence that different writers had on each other, it becomes clear that boundaries between genres were porous, and ideas they traveled freely across them. To that matter, Joyce's engagement with these broader literary and cultural developments shows his work as not merely autobiographical or Irish in a parochial sense, but as a part of a far reaching artistic movement. His fiction exemplifies how personal history or national identity, linguistic experimentation, European cultural discourse, all of them intersect in the form of literary modernism. His he having a Joyce having an artistic vision, which is again shaped by the intricacies of his own experiences, and there are other cultural influences of his time. All of them allow to explore themes of identity, language, and artistic creation, with some kind or the other, with depth or complexity that continue to influence literature to this day. So, in order to really understand what kind of thematic depth the novel showcases or has, it is absolutely essential to grasp the socio political backdrop of Ireland during the 19th and early 20th century, particularly what role the Charles Stewart Parnell in Irish politics and played, and how his dramatic fall from grace left a profound psychological scar, on many national consciousnesses, including that of Joyce. Ireland at the time was a nation striving for autonomy, predominantly Catholic in religious affiliation, and still under the grip of British colonial rule. However, within this context, Parnell emerged as a emerged as a leader, Protestant leader, who managed to command immense influence over the Irish Catholic majority, leading the Irish Parliamentary Party and pushing for home rule in the British Parliament. Somehow the other transcended divisions and symbolized a unified Irish hope for political self determination. Then there was a sudden downfall, Parnell's downfall, and it was dramatic. Absolutely. The scandal that led to his ruin was deeply personal. There was a divorce case which was brought by Captain O'Shea, a fellow parliamentarian, who revealed Parnell's long standing affair with his wife, Kitty O'Shea. Although this was a matter of private indiscretion, its implications were monumental. The scandal broke at a moment when political unity was crucial, and it prompted the then British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, to distance himself from Parnell. More significantly, the leaders of the Irish Catholic Church, who had until then supported Parnell, published condemnations against him, or effectively severing him from his political base. So this was completely an act of betrayal, especially from religious and political leaders who had once praised him, creating a feeling of collective abandonment and disillusionment among Irish nationalists. In Joyce's novel, this national betrayal is not presented as a dry historical account, but something to do with emotional experience. In some of the chapters, in the early chapters of the book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, there is a dinner table scene in which the topic of Parnell sparks a heated family argument. This episode is particularly memorable not only for its dramatic tension, but for what it reveals about the fragmented Irish psyche. Stephen, which we know as the young protagonist, he witnesses a conflict between devotion to family and loyalty to national heroes, between religious authority and political idealism. And right now, he's too young to articulate these feelings. But the moment of the situation left a deep impression on his growing consciousness. He was surrounded with pain and confusion, and uh, he was intensely aware of how political subjugation had contributed to spiritual and intellectual malice in Ireland. He believed that centuries of colonial rule had not just impoverished the country materially, but also had distorted the Irish mind. And they also have produced what he described as a slavish mentality. So his rejection of both British imperialism and blind Irish nationalism stemmed from his belief. He saw that rather than fostering critical consciousness and individual freedom, many Irish people had become overly reliant on the authority of church and state. So for Joyce, true liberation had to begin with an internal awakening, an expansion of the individual's consciousness, one that refused to accept imposed values unquestionably. Um, at the turn of the century, while revivalist movements gained momentum in Ireland, pushing for a return to Gaelic culture, mythology, and national pride, Joyce remained skeptical. For example, when the Irish National Theatre Society was established in 1901, which would later give rise to the famous Abbey Theatre and the Irish literary revival under figures like W. Yeats and Lady Gregory, Joyce did not join in the enthusiasm. He believed such cultural revivals, though well intentioned, often romanticized a mythical past at the expense of confronting the real, painful issues of the present. In his view, these efforts substituted nostalgia for truth and distracted from the more urgent need to develop an independent, critical, and modern Irish consciousness. Thus, in the book, um, the political and the cultural tensions surrounding Ireland's identity are embedded deeply into the personal development of Stephen Dedalus. Stephen's eventual decision to leave Ireland is not just again a personal act of rebellion, but also a very symbolic rejection of nations mired in betrayal, paralysis, and conformity. His departure is an attempt to escape the suffocation that is influenced through religious dogma or familial obligation. He seeks not exile for his own sake, but for creative and intellectual freedom, which he believes Ireland cannot offer him. So, James Joyce's life is deeply interwoven with the fabric of the book, a portrait of the artist as a young man, making an understanding of his personal history essential for fully appreciating the novel's themes, character development, and the emotional undertones that it covers. The novel, though fictional, is heavily autobiographical in nature, and many of its key events or emotional conflicts or settings are direct reflections of Joyce's own experiences. So, this is about the context. Unit 1. Let's go to Unit 2. Unit 2 that covers the genre and overall structure and point of view. Unit 2. So here in this unit, we will be introduced to the narrative technique, and there will be some discussions on the genre. There will be some discussions on the overall structure, and then we discuss the point of view of it. So the narration in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man evolves noticeably across its 5 chapters. So there are total 5 chapters. In the first 4 chapters, the narrator is more indulgent and sympathetic towards the protagonist. The protagonist here that we are talking about is the character Stephen Dedulus. Even when irony is present, it generally supports Stephen and portrays his errors or immaturities as natural consequences of youth and growing up. This allows the readers, the audience, to stay closely aligned with the inner life of Stephens, seeing the world largely through his emotional and intellectual experiences. As we move ahead, we navigate through all the chapters and reach chapter 5. The tone of the narration shifts. Now there is a greater detachment between the narrator and the character Stephen. The narrative voice becomes more objective, possibly even subtly critical, suggesting that Stephen is no longer simply a figure of youthful experimentation, but someone whose ideas and decisions need to be judged with a certain degree of maturity and distance. This is one kind of a narrative technique, and this is important because it is dual layered. On the one hand, we are deeply embedded in Stephen's consciousness, which gives the novel an intimacy usually found in first person narratives. On the other hand, there exists a mature, reflective consciousness, a kind of implied narrator that runs alongside Stephen's perspective. Now, this second voice often qualifies or questions Stephen's thoughts or exposing their limitations or naivety or self importance without breaking the immersive experience of Stephen's inner life. The genre of the novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, is quite complex and layered, resisting easy classifications. Scholars like Patrick Perinder and Suzanne Nalbashian have described the novel as an ionic autobiography, an aesthetic autobiography. These terms acknowledge the facts that while the novel is deeply rooted in James Joyce's personal life and experiences, it does not function as a straightforward autobiography. Instead, it is a work of artistic reimagination, a creative transformation of Joyce's life into fictional and symbolic form. Joyce's brother, Stanislaus Joyce, he makes this distinction even clearer. He explicitly states that while the novel draws heavily from James Joyce's own experiences, the portrayal is not literal or factual. For example, Stephen Dedalus, the protagonist, is not a direct or exact representation of young James. Stanislas emphasizes that this book is an artistic creation which is reshaped deliberately and thoughtfully rather than a diary like or confessional text. His testimony reinforces the point that Joyce was not simply recording his life but reshaping it into art through the filter of imagination and dramatic structure. So, the portrait, the book shares features of both the Bildungsroman and uh, there is one more psychological or moral growth of the protagonist. This is the coming of age story that focuses on the psychological and the moral growth of the protagonist, often from childhood to adulthood. Other examples, as we studied Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, can be one of the example. And there is Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage. And there is another book, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Manns. These are all examples of Bildungsroman, who talks about the psychological or the moral growth from childhood into as and how one moves ahead in his life, especially till adulthood. So, in Joy's case, a transition from his earlier, more explicitly autobiographical work, Stephen Hero, to a portrait marks a deliberate artistic shift. The earlier draft, Stephen Hero, was much more lyrical or personal and documentary in style, almost like a narrated journal. But over a decade, Joyce reworked the material, evolving from a novel of the overt and partisan manager into a text shaped by the hand of an invisible and impersonal director. This metaphor highlights how Joyce removed himself more and more from the foreground, allowing Stephen's character to unfold symbolically rather than as simple stand in for himself. This transformation is significant. In the book, uh, Joyce uses a highly refined narrative technique to objectify and depersonalize his own experiences. Even though the material remains closely biographical, the focus is no longer on simply recounting events from his life, but on but on mythology and symbolicals that is present throughout. Through his book, Joyce elevates naturalistic details to a dramatic and symbolic level, giving it a universal resonance. The novel becomes not just a personal story, but a meditation on the universal struggles of identity, art, faith, and independence. So, overall, the book is neither a literal autobiography nor a purely fictional tale. It is best understood as a hybrid genre, something which is symbolic and aesthetic, retelling the personal experience shaped by artistic intent, rooted in the European literary tradition. And here, the geniusness lies in how he transforms the raw material of life into a structured, layered work of high modernist literature. So, overall structure of a portrait of the artist as a young man follows a progressive development of Stephen Dedalus' consciousness from early childhood to his decision to leave Orland in pursuit of artistic freedom. His growth is carefully mapped across all the five chapters, each marking a significant stage in Stephen's psychological, emotional, and intellectual journey. The novel is organized both thematically and structurally to reflect the fluctuations in his inner life. Maybe his doubts, maybe his discoveries, his confessions or assertions, his awakenings, all this kind. The first chapter begins with Stephen's infantile awareness, capturing the world as a series of fragmented impressions and sensations through language, smell, texture, emotions, affections, fears, etc. This sensory world slowly becomes more coherent as Stephen grows. The chapter ends with Stephen asserting his individual his individuality by protesting against an injustice, and that injustice was his punishment that was given to him by a teacher in his school, which marked his first step towards forming a moral and intellectual self. Then we go to the second chapter where we come to know the early stages of adolescence and the alienation that begins to grow with it. Stephen becomes increasingly aware of the conflict between his desires and the strictures of the world around him, including his family or religion and education. This chapter culminates in his encounter with a prostitute, a significant moment that marks his entry into sexual experiences and a break from the innocence of childhood. Then we come to read the third chapter where uh, the chapter deals with the crisis of adolescence. After indulging in sin, Stephen is overcoming with guilt and fear of damnation. He begins to deeply engage with Catholic teachings, experiences, um, which are connected with intense spiritual dread, and considers joining the priesthood. His internal turmoil reaches a peak here in this chapter as he um, hangs himself between sin and salvation, or desire and duty. And then the fourth chapter represents a turning point. Stephen rejects the priesthood after a moment of insight and chooses instead the path of the artist. He realizes the difference, and it is so clear and obvious that in priesthood, it is still some form of conformity that he is getting to bind with. However, if it is an artist, the path of an artist, it is free from any kind of conformity, rather true calling through artistic creation. And again, it is not a religious servitude which he found in priesthood. The climax of this chapter is symbolic, a moment of epiphany by the sea, where he becomes aware of the beauty and power of the world, and through that, of his own vocation. And then the next chapter, the fifth chapter, which is more detached in tone compared to the earlier ones. The narration becomes more ionic and distanced, no longer sympathetic to Stephen's illusion. The chapter here captures Stephen's university life, his evolving atheist story, and his preparations for self imposed exile. The focus here shifts from spiritual conflict to intellectual exploration. There is again a shift from emotional upheaval to ideological formation. This chapter is also more reflective as Stephen articulates his philosophy of art and freedom through his conversations with his friend Cranley, another character. The novel ends with his declaration of independence, a commitment to life as an artistic feature beyond the confines of Ireland, religion, and family. So, structurally, the novel can be broken down even further into 19 smaller narrative units marked by typographical breaks. These units help convey the fluid nature of Stephen's consciousness and the evolutionary process of his identity formation. Each phase of his growth is embedded in memory, and memory functions as the underlying narrative device that links the past with the present, tying each moment in his development into a whole world, into a cohesive world of his own. So Joyce's techniques involves repetitions of motifs, and these repetitions of motive as a technique is a hallmark of modernist writing. These repeated images or ideas, for example, birds, flight, music, water, these gain symbolic significance over time. This use of incremental repetition helps build structure and texture in a subtle way, giving depth to Stephen's inner life and dramatizing his evolving personality. For um, uh, many of the readers, this particular book, The Portrait of Artist as a Young Man, uh, they view this book simply not as a linear narrative of events, but they suggest that it is deeply structured journey, a journey that starts from psychological element and crosses over towards being artistic and finally transcending into nothingness. So the issue here, that still many of the readers um, find some kind of reflection is not confusion but the intricate architecture of thought and memory, which is shaped by the fluidity of time and reception. So this is all about the overall structure of the book. Now coming to the next section of point of view. The issue of point of view in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is deeply tied to James Joyce's larger project of investigating how a writer situates himself in relation to his protagonist. In his novel, Joyce navigates a careful and sophisticated balance between identification and irony, empathy and critique. This is far from a straightforward narrative technique. Rather, it is a complex interplay of narrative perspectives that reflects Joyce's unique and evolving relationship with Stephen Dedalus. his fictional alter ego. Much like Jane Austen's treatment of Emma in Emma, where irony coexists with subtle sympathy, Joyce crafts a narrative in which Stephen's consciousness is the main medium through which events and perceptions are filtered. Yet, at no point is the reader permitted to take Stephen's view entirely at face value. There is always a tension between the immediacy of Stephen's inner life and the subtle authorial voice that quietly judges, questions, or distances itself from that consciousness. This dual perspective creates a dynamic, shifting point of view. On the one hand, Joyce allows readers to see the world as Stephen sees it, particularly in the early chapters, where the narrative style mimics the fragmented impressions and associative leaps of a child's mind. On the other, as Stephen matures, the language of the narration grows increasingly sophisticated, tracking the intellectual growth while also introducing a parallel, more detached consciousness that can view Stephen's thoughts and actions with irony or critique. At times, the narrative appears almost omniscient, stepping back from Stephen to offer a comment or a touch of gentle mockery, while at other moments it dives so deeply into thoughts that it becomes difficult to distinguish the narrator's voice from Stephen's own. This kind of narration invites readers into a complex relationship with Stephen. Sometimes the audience sympathize with his sensitivity, his suffering, his desire for freedom, and his artistic aspiration. But sometimes the audience is also amused by his pretensions, his youthful self importance, and his melodramatic romanticism. So, Stephen as a character is not always an easy character who the audience can really enjoy. But Joyce does not expect even that the audience should do so uncritically. In fact, Joyce himself later admitted that he may have been too harsh on Stephen, suggesting that even the author recognized the ambivalent tone his narration had taken towards this young protagonist. Crucially, the novel does not promise or even imply that Stephen will succeed as an artist. His artistic declarations, especially towards the last chapter, are not necessarily endorsed by the novel itself. Instead, Joyce presents the conditions under which an artist must struggle to define himself, particularly in the stifling environment of Irish Catholic society. Stephen's development is not marked by a transformation of character so much as a deepening of tendencies already present. His reserve matures into independence, his pride into a more defined sense of individuality, and his sensitivity into the foundation of his artistic sensibility. These aspects are revealed in his increasingly complex interactions with others, particularly his friends and family during his university years. Joy's attitude towards Stephen, while occasionally ironic, is rarely cruel or dismissive. He uses irony not to belittle Stephen, but to highlight the distance between the youthful idealism of the character and the more nuanced understanding of the author or reader. For instance, when Stephen's grand schemes fall apart, as in the passage where his imagination towards financial empire collapses, with the loan bank closed its coffers and its book at a sensible loss, there is a gentle humor, even a sense of affection in the way Joyce describes these childish ambitions unravelingly. So, particularly, chapter 5 showcases Stephen's more generous and sociable side, often downplayed in discussions of his supposed arrogance. His ability to tolerate and even enjoy the banter of his peers suggests a more grounded human aspect of his personality. This side of Stephen reveals itself quietly, adding complexity to a character often seen through the lens of isolation and self absorption. Despite Joyce's preference of stylistic restraint and formal control, a hallmark of his classical leanings, there are numerous moments in the novel where romanticism breaks through unironically. Stephen's preoccupation with language, his fascination with the mysteries of Europe, and his yearning for escape all point to a romantic temperament that is never entirely disowned by Joyce. The novel contains passages of great lyrical beauty that suggest transcendence through art and imagination. One such moment is Stephen's reverie as he contemplates the bales of merchandise at the dock, where the sense of the exotic, the vast, and the unknown stirs in him a deep yearning for elsewhere. This motive culminates in his dream of Europe, where he envisions drifting clouds as nomadic travelers, symbolizing his own longing for artistic and intellectual freedom beyond the borders of Holland. Ultimately, Joyce manages the point of view in the portrait with the masterful subtlety. He creates a narrative voice that is deeply embedded in Stephen consciousness, yet also capable of ionic detachment. This dual perspective allows for a full, rich portrayal of a developing mind, one that invites us to understand, question, admire, and occasionally laugh at its subject. The boundary between Joyce and Stephen is fluid, shifting from moment to moment, and it is precisely this modulation of narrative intimacy that gives the novel its enduring power and complexity. So we are done with unit 2. I suppose you should take a break of 10 minutes. At 3:30 we meet again. So, welcome back after the break. Before the break, we had covered Unit 1 and Unit 3, sorry, Unit 2. And now we'll start with Unit 3. And this is Stephen's growth and personality. So, as of now, we have understood that we are dealing with a character named Stephen Dedulus, and he's a central character of the novel. And here we are tracing upon the psychological and the artistic developmental stages from his early childhood through his adolescent crisis, and how finally he embraces his calling as an artist. So, so right now we are in Unit 3, Stephen's growth and personality. The personality as a whole cannot be studied as something in its current or present context. Rather, when we talk about developmental stages of personality, it's always suggestive to see the past and how the past is in connection with the present. So, if we focus here with the novel, we come to know that. The novel focuses on the perspective of an infant first. So it's very important to note how the personality from the infant stage starts to develop gradually and eventually, and that made him take such a strong decision of quitting Orland and focusing on the inner calling that he had been completely subjecting himself into. So the novel, in its opening lines, we are introduced to this character Stephen, and he presents himself through the childlike languages and perceptions of his earliest years. The world around him is sensory, is vivid, is fragmented, and it captures impressions from family, sometimes of warmth, discomfort, and confusion. As he grows, he experiences early education, where he feels isolated, bullied, and ultimately suffers an unjust punishment by one of the teacher. This incident marks his first act, where he took the strong decision to complain against the teacher and against the injustice. So, although it is a seemingly very small moment, but this moment is Stephen's first assertion of personal integrity and self worth. And this is a theme that that James has been recurring throughout the novel. So, in his early home life, Stephen is exposed to conflicting political and religious ideologies, particularly during a tense Christmas dinner scene where Parnell's legacy becomes the point of a bitter argument between adults. These early ideological conflicts make a deeper impression on Stephen, embedding in him a sense of disillusionment and internal conflict that continues to develop. As the novel progresses into the next chapter, Stephen is seen moving through adolescence, growing increasingly alienated and introspective. He experiences fantasies and yearning for an idealized women, most notably Mercedes, reflecting both a sexual awakening and a romanticized view of love that will later become a subject of disillusionment. Stephen's developing sexual culminations in this very significant is a very significant movement where he solicits a prostitute. This act, charged with guilt, desire, and rebellion, marks his full entry into the adult world of sin and self awareness. What follows is a deep crisis of conscience in the next chapter, and during religious retreat at his school, a series of sermons on sin, judgments, deaths, and hell plunge Stephen into overwhelming guilt. The vivid imagery of eternal damnation leaves him terrified and desperate for redemption. In a state of emotional collapse, he confesses his sins and undergoes a temporary conversions, even considering priesthood as a potential vocation. However, this newfound uh, um, thought of process towards um, making himself completely into priesthood soon becomes, or soon he finds that this is shallow and incompatible with his true nature. As and how we move in the next few chapters, we see the personality begins to develop some kind of distancing from the religious constraints and moral frameworks that once used to govern him. He finds solace and inspiration in beauty, particularly in a vision of a girl wading in the sea, and something in him awakens the sense of his artistic vocation, the call to live freely and creatively rather than within the rigid structures of church or nation or family. He begins to formulate an aesthetic theory of art, borrowing from Aquinas but reshaping it to suit his own ideals. Art for Stephen becomes the means of capturing beauty and expressing the profound truth of human experience. And apparently, we see Stephen as a university student, more intellectually mature, but also increasingly detached and aloof. The narrative itself becomes more distant and ionic, reflecting the growing gulf between Stephen and the world around him. He engages in philosophical discussions with friends and grapples with some principles that continues to refine his belief that the artist must stand apart from society. He speaks of art as an escape from the mundane, a flight into a realm of eternal beauty and truth. His conversations reveal a fierce commitment to individuality and a rejection of conformity. However, there is also a certain arrogance and coldness in his manner, suggesting that his embrace of art comes at the cost of emotional connection and belonging. Stephen's relationship with women, especially with Emma, illustrates another key aspect of his growth. Initially, he idolizes women, placing them on a pedestal of romantic purity, but over the period of time, his experience lead him to recognize the complex identifications of the females that he meets and his own conflicted feelings towards them. His aesthetic theory largely excludes personal relationships, indicating that his commitment to art demands a sacrifice of personal intimacy. So we see Stephen as a personality who is determined to forge a life of artistic freedom abroad. He prepares to leave Ireland. His final journal entries reflect a combination of hope, uncertainty, and convictions. He declares his intention to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. A bold assertion, this line from the book is a bold assertion of artistic purpose and national identity shaped on his own terms. The novel ends not with closure, but with an open ended sense of departure and becoming. Ultimately, the book is richly textured account of the personal development where the conflicts of religion and personal desire are played out in the realm of consciousness, which is again sensitive and often tortured through the innovative narrative technique that Joyce presents. Um, Stephen Dedalus, especially in chapter 4, where the book marks the spiritual high point of his early journey, only to later reject the priestly life in favor of artistic freedom, um, confesses uh, that Stephen experiences an almost euphoric sense of purity. His prayers rise like perfume from his cleansed heart, and his step is light as he walks through the muddy streets by invisible grace. This symbolic rebirth initially leads him to embrace a rigorous life of spiritual discipline and devotion. He structures his life around religious order, attending Mass daily and dedicating each day of the week to encounter a specific deadly sin through prayer. Joyce represents this new existence as increasingly disconnected from reality. Stephen begins to subordinate the material world to an abstract ideal of holiness, losing touch with the complexities of lived experiences, actual lived experiences. The possibility of priesthood is introduced when the director of studies invites Stephen for an interview. At first, Stephen is flattered, is intrigued. The director's description of priesthood as an exalted vocation aligns with Stephen's own fantasies of power and spiritual authority. Stephen imagines himself as a priest commanding reverence from saints and angels. But just as quickly as this fantasy arises, it begins to fall apart. As Stephen leaves the office, he sees four young men walking past, singing and full of energy, a sharp contrast to the joyless priestly life. Now, this moment triggers again some kind of reaction in him. The image of a youthful vitality remains free from what he thought could be the actual scenario of being a priest. Memories of school, the cold dormitories, and the stagnant air of the baths awaken instincts stronger than his religious devotion. He begins to see priesthood not as a spiritual calling, but as a form of entrapment, a path that would rob him of his individuality and will not him live his life fully, will snatch away all his imaginative freedom. So he concludes that he's not destined for religious or social conformity, but for an existence defined by personal wisdom and artistic wandering. He accepts that he will fall into sin again, but this immersion in life's confusion um, would only make him realize that this is clearly a disorder and an imperfection, more in tune with his soul than the sterile perfection of priesthood. So, this realization of his growing independence is marked by a symbolism sundering of the bond between him and his mother, because he remembers his mother's opposition to his university education, and this becomes a part of his growing sense of separation. He begins to recognize that his inner journey will isolate him not only from institutions like the church, but also from that of his own family. So later he goes to the sea, and there near the sea, Stephen sees a young girl wading in the tide. Her image becomes a moment of aesthetic and spiritual revelation. She is both real and mythic, and her presence ignites a response in Stephen that is unlike anything he experienced through religious devotion. Her beauty touches something deeper and freer in him. In her gaze, he finds no guilt, no condemnation, only something which is silent, something which is sacred and calling. This moment awakens the artistic spirit within him. He feels like he took a rebirth, and not just through confession, but through an epiphany. This vision becomes the turning point in his life. It leads to a powerful sense of transcendence and awakening. The girl's image, her gesture, her presence all become symbols of the kind of beauty and truth that Stephen will now devote himself to as an artist. And then how we move ahead, we see in the last chapter, which opens with Stephen at home, now more deeply aware of the poverty and dysfunction surrounding him. He is pawning family belongings, showing the declines of his family's fortune. Yet, even in this bleak domestic reality, Stephen is transformed. He is no longer burdened by guilt or fear of sin. Instead, he walks through Dublin with a heightened awareness, seeing the city and its people through the lens of an emerging aesthetic philosophy. He engages in debates with friends, discussing Irish nationalism, religion, and art. He distinguishes himself by refusing to conform to political or religious ideologies, insisting instead on the autonomy of the artist. Stephen aesthetic theories, although abstract, and sometimes met with indifference by his peers, present his serious attempt to articulate a new vision of life. He is now fully committed to shaping his own path, guided not by church or nation, but by the artistic imagination. The name Daedalus becomes increasingly significant. He identifies with the mythical craftsmanship who built the labyrinth and fashioned wings to escape it. By the end of the novel, Stephen has made his choice. His departure from Ireland, which is not shown but implied, marks the culmination of his inward journey. He will go into exile to forge his identity as an artist. He knows the path will be difficult, uncertain, and lonely, yet he chose to embrace it with a sense of purpose. His diary entries reveal both confidence and vulnerability. He is stepping into the unknown and he knows it, armed with nothing but his conviction and his artistic vision. The closing image of the novel reflects his readiness to take flight, like Daedalus, leaving behind the entrapments of his past to create something entirely new out of the materials of life itself. So the narrative strategy allows for both identification with and critical distance from Stephen. Readers often sympathize with the struggle for self definition and artistic independence, yet they are also invited to recognize his pretensions, his vanity, and his occasional immaturity. Joyce himself later admitted that he might have judged Stephen too harshly, indicating an awareness of the novel's ambivalent stance towards its protagonist. Importantly, Joyce does not guarantee that Stephen will become a successful artist. This is also we have discussed. Rather, the novel focuses on Stephen's commitment to a life guided by aesthetic and intellectual values as opposed to the allegiances, for example, social, religious, national, and family. So there is another section in Unit 3, and which is very important, talks about Stephen and his connection with women. The figure of woman plays a very deeply complex motive, often contradictory role in Stephen Dedulus' psychological and artistic development. Women in the novel appear not merely as individuals but as powerful symbols that represent different aspects of Stephen's inner life. For example, his emotions, his desires, his evolution, his fantasies, his artistic vision. Stephen's relationship with women, or rather his encounters with the idea of women, are fragmented, idealized, and often disconnected from real human interaction. This disconnection is symptomatic of his emotional isolation and internal conflicts, particularly as they relate to sexuality or religion or artistic identity. The very first significant female presence outside Stephen's family is Aileen, a childhood friend who fascinates him with her white hands and golden hair. The details which is given by Joyce, although is minimal, are telling as they reflect Stephen's early susceptibility to aesthetic impressions and his romantic, even fascistic fascination with feminine beauty. Yet the relationship with Aileen never amounts to anything substantial. She remains a passing image in his memory, emblematic more of youthful curiosity and wonder than any real interpersonal connection. Then his fantasy involves Mercedes, a character he borrows from The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Mercedes exceeds purely in Stephen's imagination, serving as a vehicle for his early romantic idealism and wounded pride. He imagines grandly rejecting her love after she had once slighted him, and this scenario reveals not only Stephen's hunger for romantic recognition, but also the egotism that underlies his imagination. Now, this is a theme that recurs in later interactions in the novel. Mercedes also becomes a symbol of unattainable love and self dramatization, and not a person in her own right. Next, we meet a female figure, and this female figure is also as significant, Emma Clary, who reappears at various points in the narrative and who most closely resembles a potential love interest. His first significant encounter with Emma takes place at a party in Harold's Cross, where Stephen separates him from the group of the friends to enjoy his solitary thoughts, only to notice Emma glancing at him repeatedly. Their shared exchange of looks uh, is further charged with a subtle romantic tension. Emma's actions stepping up to join him on the tram step are an open invitation for intimacy. Yet, Stephen, paralyzed by shyness, insecurity, or perhaps a deeper fear of connection, fails to respond. The failure haunts him not because of a broken heart, but because of a bruised ego. His response is not to seek reconciliation or clarity with Emma, but to compose a poem for her, again converting a real life possibility into a literary abstraction. 2 years later, Stephen performs in a school and fantasizes that Emma will be present. The anticipation here builds and the emotional romantic crescendo within him, only to collapse when she does not attend. This missed connection becomes another turning point in Stephen's sexual development. Deprived of romantic fulfillment, his repressed desires erupt elsewhere, culminating in his visit to prostitutes and his first sexual experience with a prostitute. This moment is portrayed with striking sensuality and even reverence. The prostitute is not condemned or degraded. Instead, she provides Stephen with not only physical release but a sense of affirmation and confidence. She is, in a strange way, maternal, gentle, accepting, reassuring. The encounter marks a turning point. The suppression of desires gives way to its expression, and Stephen gains a temporary feeling of wholeness. Another female figure after the brothel scene, this time is the wading girl on the beach who appears as an image that radically transforms Stephen's soul. Her beauty, her bare legs, and her serene confidence cause an outburst of what Stephen calls profane joy. He experiences a moment of ecstatic revelation where physical beauty, sensuality, and spiritual inspiration converge. Unlike earlier women who are remembered or fantasized about, the waiting girl is a present living reality. She presents the fusion of art, nature, and desire, awakening in Stephen a new awareness of life and creative potential. Importantly, this moment is silent, free of social and moral constraints, and it allows Stephen to imagine a future shaped not by sin or guilt, but by beauty and art. She becomes a symbol not of temptation, but of liberation. So, these are some of the women figures in Unit 3 who have some way or the other influenced the growth and personality of Stephen. We now move to Unit 4, and Unit 4, it is the technique that Joyce has incorporated in the novel. So there is a stylistic innovation, a remarkable stylistic innovation, and a mark of psychological and philosophical depth, uh, which is found here. Joyce lays the groundwork for the more radical experiments he would undertake in Ulysses. Yet, even in this book, the book stands as a masterclass in the literary technique in its own right. And what makes the style here particularly compelling is the ability of Joyce to tailor the language or the rhythm or the structure of narration to the evolving consciousness of his protagonist, Stephen Dedalus. Language is not merely a vehicle for storytelling here, but it is in itself transformation to reflect the inner and outer worlds of Stephen at different phases of his life. From the very first lines of the novel, Joyce makes it clear that this would be a narrative unlike the traditional realist or omniscient storytelling modes. The famous opening passage, once upon a time and a very good time, it was there. Once upon a time and a very good time, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, quotes close, mimics the voice and mind of a toddler. The vocabulary is simple and childlike. Syntax is broken into brief, often fragmentary phrases. Narration offers a direct presentation of fleeting sensations or sounds or smells and associations which together reconstruct the inner world of a young child. In these lines, we see Joyce not describing a child from the outside, but rather stimulating the very texture of a child's thought process. There is no mediation. What we experience is the unfiltered stream of Stephen's early perceptions and associations. This marks a major break from the conventional narration technique and signals Joy's commitment to what we call stream of consciousness. Though it is important to recognize that this book uses a more controlled and evolving version of that technique that uh, than any of Joyce's later works. Stephen grows, the language also changes. Language of the novel matures. School years, we encounter a perceptible shift in tone and vocabulary. Narration begins to reflect a more self aware, observant perspective. Vocabulary expands, syntax becomes more structured, and the content reflects a child coming into awareness of his physical presence and social environment. There are words like fake, rump, scut, they start appearing, reflecting the slang of schoolboys and the crude realities of daily life in school. There is a clear contrast between this language and the lyrical simplicity of the earlier pieces. This stylistic shift reflects not just the maturing of the protagonist, but also the increasing intrusion of external forces. For example, the teachers, the peers, the punishment scene, all of them having a deep influence on the personal world. Another notable stylistic modulation occurs during Christmas dinner scene. Here the tone becomes more dramatic, almost theatrical. The dialogue takes on a performative character as the adult world, with all its political and religious tensions, bursts into Stephen's previously sheltered consciousness. The formality and the rhetoric of the adult's speech signal to the reader that Stephen is witnessing something formative, something that foreshadows his later ideological conflicts. Joyce is careful to present this scene through Stephen's eyes, but the language of the adults remains intact, giving us a dual sense of immersion in the conversation and a filter of youthful perception. Later, particularly in the second or the third chapter, the narration gradually shifts again to reflect Stephen's adolescent romanticism and his first encounters with sexuality. When Stephen begins to fantasize about Mercedes and later Emma, the prose becomes ornate, self consciously poetic, filled with phrases that mimic the language of sentimental romantic fiction. And this is not accidental or indulgent on Joyce's part. Rather, it reflects Stephen's own literary aspirations and his immaturity. Style, im- immaturity, stylized way of viewing emotions and women. For instance, when Stephen prepares himself to play the great part in his imagined romantic drama with Emma, the tone is overwrought, suggesting both the intensity and the artificiality of the inner world. When Stephen walks through Dublin's red light district and ultimately visits a prostitute, the style takes another sharp turn. The prose becomes grittier, more grounded in physical reality. Here, the language is direct, sometimes crude, sometimes concrete, um, expressing Stephen's lived experiences. Yet, this is not simple realism. There is still a lyrical undercurrent showing how even these moments of lust are filtered through the sensibility of an artist in the making. After this encounter, we find yet another stylistic modulation, excuse me, this time towards the heightened rhetoric of religious discourse. The effect is hypnotic, overwhelming, both for Stephen and the audience. At this point, the prose becomes a means of evoking not Stephen's inner life but the overpowering external force of Catholic doctrine bearing down on him. After Stephen confesses and is temporarily restored to a state of grace, the prose again becomes more elevated, gentle, and luminous. The tone softens, the sense of peace is conveyed through lighter imagery and a more flowing sentence structure. And finally, in the last chapter, especially in the diary entries that close the novel, the style becomes fragmented and telegraphic, introspective. The shift to first person narration in the form of diary marks Stephen's full emergence as a self aware artist. Syntax is more compact, the thoughts are more sharply focused, and the language reflects a mind now intensely preoccupied with creation, departure, and individual purpose. Now, this is the final section where there is a revelation of a new kind of maturity. The artist has begun to articulate his vision, however uncertain or ambiguous of its outcome. So, throughout the novel, Joyce does not merely narrate the story, but he enacts the language. He makes the stylistic shifts to be the integral part of the novel structure. He does it not to decorate it, but to provide meaning. So, they provide a formal mirror of Stephen's evolution from childhood to the would be artist. So, in doing so, Joyce not only pioneers new ground of narration but also demonstrates that language itself can become the very fabric of consciousness in fiction. So, let's understand the stream of consciousness and epiphany. This is one of the important section under Unit 4 technique, the stream of consciousness. So, some indication of the implications of the term stream of consciousness has already uh, been given by certain writers and authors, equating it through words like train of thought. Uh, the method is in evidence at many places in a portrait, more so in the opening and the closing pages of the novel. The emphasis is given to the stream of consciousness method, which is on the psychic being of the characters, and the associative mode is kept in forefront of Stephen's consciousness. This is at the heart of the novel, and it is both its subject matter and its major structuring mechanism. In the opening and the closing pages, the inner aspect of this consciousness is on view. At the start, the reader is rushed back and forth through sudden disruptions. The story of the Mukau, the memory of the father leading to the memory of his mother, associations leading to Aileen, the coldness of the bed and its wetness are all part of associative processes, as are the smells exuded by Stephen's parents. Another good example of the method is when Stephen is on the football field. He's in the middle of a scrimmage and is thinking of going home for the holidays. So he longs for the warmth of the room where he has pasted at his desk the number of days still remaining between them and the holidays. His thoughts on the field move in quick succession from his cold hands to the various meanings of the world, to nasty expressions used by the boys, to his mother warnings not to speak to the rough boys, and so on. So, the way associative processes are pressed into the services of the weaving together of recurrent motifs is quite obvious. Uh, so, the diary jottings at the end also are syntactical. much closer to the style of Ulysses due to their being more fragmentary. Now, the concept of epiphany is basic to the appreciation of Joyce's general approach in the book. By an epiphany, Joyce meant a sudden spiritual manifestation or showing forth with some touching of the connotations of the world. It is possible to see the book, a portrait, as incorporating a sequence of related epiphanies in the form of forward moving narrative. The showing forth that Joyce had in mind was the reality of an object, a person, or an event. The estuary epiphany is the most notable example of the kind of showing forth that Joyce had in mind. What happens here is that Stephen, in the flash of insight, recognizes the call of his artistic vocation, transfigured into the form of the wedding girl, who becomes for him the embodiment of art and beauty. The second thing to note is that another aspect of Epiphany is conveyed to us in the wild transport of delight experienced by Stephen at the sight of the girl. The two aspects have a way of reinforcing each other. They resonate and bring the fourth chapter to its rapturous climax. The linguistic feature as a section under Unit 4 technique also plays a vital role in shaping the novel's impressive and psychologically rich narrative. There is a precision in language and it serves a dual purpose. It allows for minute and textured portrayals of external reality, and on the other, it reflects the inner workings of Stephen's mind. There are a few lines in the material, and you could sense how there is an expansion of the participial phrase, further modified by uh, the lines given in that PDF. You can check with that. So these layerings, they continue to detail up a descriptive density, and it captures the psychological experiences that Joyce wants to present through Stephen's consciousness. So this is Unit 4, end of Unit 4. We come to the last unit, Unit 5. Critical perspectives, a brief selective overview. So it's important to know the early critical reception. Uh, Early critical reception of a portrait of the artist as a young man was mixed with both praise and criticism offered by viewers, sorry, to who struggled to fully categorize or understand the novel's experimental style. Some of the negative reactions focused on what critics perceived as a lack of structure or coherence. The novel's fragmented form and stream of consciousness narration led several early readers to see it as disorganized or even chaotic, particularly even when compared to the more conventionally structured novels of the 19th century. In addition to the stylistic concerns, some critics were disturbed by Joyce's frank treatment of physicality and sexuality. The unflinching realism, especially in scenes dealing with Stephen's adolescent desires, guilt, and his encounter with a woman from the brothel, was seen by some as prurient or overly explicit. Others found that the long sermons and the philosophical discussions of the aesthetics, while intellectually interesting, seemed not fully integrated into the novel's narrative, as though they interrupted rather than enriched the flow of Stephen's personal journey. The novel also attracted strong, thoughtful praise. Several influential writers and critics recognized its originality and emotional power. For example, Hart Crane, the American poet, describes the novel as spiritually inspiring, emphasizing its emotional depth and the way it portrayed the inner life of a sensitive, searching young man. H.G. Wells, a major literary figure of the time, admired the novel's realism and accuracy, calling it by far the most living and convincing picture that exists of an Irish Catholic upbringing. Another viewer, Francis Hackett, though acknowledging that the novel was not entirely pleasant, still found it in some way or the other a compelling intensity. He praised it for its love of beauty, pathos, and honesty, emotional intensity, and saying it goes beyond anything in English that reveals the inevitable uh, sickness of serious youth. Hackett saw the novel as an unflinching portrait of the psychological struggles faced by an intelligent and introspective young person. Similarly, John Macy described the book as outspoken, vigorous, original, and beauty, capturing the essence of Joy's artistic achievement despite or perhaps because of its departure from convention. So, what can be the subsequent criticism to the book? Reflecting all out of the evolving understanding of Joyce's novel, shaped largely by shifting literary paradigms over the 20th and 21st century. While early responses were often divided, later critical work developed along two broad lines: those who critiqued the novel's perceived limitations, and those who appreciate it, particularly in the context of modernism and psychoanalysis. On one hand, we see there are critics like Hugh Kenner and Wayne Booth who raised concerns about Joyce's narrative approach. Kenner believed the novel's ambiguous tone and uncertain stance towards Stephen Dedulus were intentional, designed to reflect the solipsistic quality of Stephen's worldview. Booth, meanwhile, argued that Joyce failed to manage narrative distance. So, likewise, there are few many other critics who had given their critical perspectives, and some of them have extended these ideas, especially in their books, in their write ups, as a kind of linguistic and psychoanalytical emergence, where every act of narration not only describes Stephen's growth but also creates it. And there were some sympathetic and sophisticated readings as well. Some of the critics mentioned that this novel should receive less attention than Ulysses, which offer more ground for postmodern or linguistic analysis. And there were readers who were more interested in early modernism. So for them, the portrait remains an essential text showcasing Joyce's compressed brilliance and stylistic radiance. And Derek Attridge points out Joyce's influence has become so widespread that even readers unaware of him are often indirectly engaging with his legacy through the techniques that Joyce has been providing in the book, like fragmentation, parody, self referentiality in modern media and fiction. So, overall, a portrait of the artist as a young man is not just a personal or national coming of age story, it is a foundational work in the transformation of literature itself. So, we are done with mm, the block. This is block 7. So we are done here. Tomorrow we meet with the new block with a new block 8, and this would be Edward Morgan Forrester, A Passage to India. Yeah, okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nayana has raised hands.
Um, Hello, ma'am. I have a
Hi.
question regarding our term and examination. So,
Okay.
will you be checking out it or some other professor will be assigned for it?
No, I would not be checking it. That is what I think. The answer sheets would be probably, to my understanding, would be shared pan India. So the best of the experts would be able to do that.
Ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Padma has a question.
Good, good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Padma. Yes.
Madam, what will be the time slot for tomorrow's session?
Tomorrow, 5 to 7. I think they will give you an email. If not,
Uh,
just remain informed that 5 to 7 would be the time.
Not received, ma'am.
Not received, no, but
Okay.
I had a talk with them. So they said that
Okay.
by today or by definitely by today they'll be sharing. If not, just know it is 5 to 7 from my end.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Shazir has a question.
Yes, ma'am. I have
Yeah.
seen that some of the old blogs, video lecturing is added by the RC. So I'm not sure whether you have given anything other than our class, any material to the college. I cannot recognize it, but there are several videos are uploaded class regarding
Okay.
the classes.
No, I have not given any uh, materials from my end as of now, but this reminds me that I can even suggest them if they need my personal notes, and if at all I can, if it's okay to share, they will be able to do that. I will remind them again. I will ask them definitely, because I remember asking them if we are allowed to share the notes, and they strictly said that there are some protocols and we need to abide by it. So the PDF and listening from the audio here and your own learning would help you get notes. But again, by tomorrow, let me come up with this suggestion again. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Niharika has a question. Niharika has raised hands.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
I had actually mentioned it in the text as well, but
Okay.
anyway, so we have come across this term aesthetic, many a times in this novel, and
Yes.
I just wanted to know if, I mean, can you just elaborate on the term aesthetic when it comes to literary sense?
Okay.
In
If I take you to a little out of the context, have you ever taken pictures or photography which you find very aesthetic?
yes, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so in that angle, what we know as something called as aesthetic is something where a beauty is elevated, and
Yes.
it is in a way, it is in a form which is uh, above all levels of beauty. So basically, when we take or elevate beauty to this reference, we understand it to be aesthetic. Now, if you ask me that whether it is a approach, whether it is a movement, so I would say it is both. It is both a movement, it is both an approach, and it is having some kind of strong connection with philosophy and also artistic expression. So it was only, I think it was only 19th century where, and especially in the Victorian England, where the term actually got conceptualized.
Okay. I'm a bit confused, but I think I get what you're saying.
Okay.
Ma'am,
And
when I say that,
Yeah.
sorry, Niharika, you go ahead.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah. That
just
was
have
it
one
from my
more
side.
question. If
Yes, yes, please.
and this is not strictly in context to this particular novel, but I was just reading somewhere in the Marxist way of Marxist literary criticism. I was reading that modernist writers, especially
Okay.
Joyce or Virginia Woolf or some like other writers,
Yes,
they
yes.
were mm, taking a step back from the modernist approach because they were writing more about the internalized concept like stream of consciousness.
Okay.
So what I mean, I did not understand that very well. How could that
Okay. Okay, I'll tell you. Maybe in very simplistic manner, I can tell you. When we know something as aesthetic, and when we know that the origin is from 19th century, and when you talked about Virginia Woolf, who belongs to the modernist era, isn't it? 20th
yes.
century. By that period, aesthetic in literature has already evolved. It did not ever vanished, but it evolved, and more writers started transforming the particular world and its essence into more with more experimentations in the language or the form or the structure, and they were all very artistic in ways. I'm so sorry for the background noise. I hope I was heard.
Yeah, yeah, ma'am, you were audible.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
okay. Thank
Uh,
you, ma'am.
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So 5 to 7 tomorrow. Thank you all of you.